Hello and welcome everybody to A Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and today I'm joined by Ashish Kulkarni. Welcome.
Namaskar.
Ashish is an independent researcher. He's done a lot of scholarly work on the genetics regarding the Aryan invasion and Aryan migration debate. He's got a very neutral standpoint. He has come at it solely from the genetics aspect, considering some of the arguments around the linguistics and the archaeological evidences. He has still approached it as independently as possible to try and keep the sciences of it very neutral. So it's quite a novel approach, and I'm looking forward to having a lot of discussions around the genetics aspect of this Aryan invasion theory today, Ashish. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me here.
All right, Ashish. So to begin with, I'd just love to understand how you got invested in this Aryan invasion theory and Aryan migration theory, and what led you to pick up genetics as your insight into the question.
Um, the Aryan, the Proto-Indo-European homeland question is actually very old, so at least 200 years, I guess.
Mhm.
And the linguistic aspects and the archaeological aspects of it were actually not taking it anywhere at all. So, just purely based on archaeology or linguistics, the solution uh, cannot be found, and it has not been found. And there are many scholars who have said that maybe they'll never find an answer to this question. And I was till 2018, I was not really invested in this topic. But there were lots of media reports of DNA research, which will help us finally solve this debate. I read all of that, and I was very intrigued, and I wanted to know how, really how can genetics be the key to solving this puzzle. So I started started reading research papers, going on blogs, and seeing what the others were thinking. And the people who were really ahead in this were the Europeans, the bloggers, and even the amateur genetics community, mainly from Europe, because the genetic testing DNA kits have really become popular there since the over the past 10 years or so, and they are really gotten into where they come from, where their paternal haplogroups come from, where their parents come from, where their mothers come from originally, like 3-4 thousand years back. And eventually, they also obviously started discussing the PI debate. So from there, basically, I got very interested in this topic. It was also a new topic, and it was actually very accessible to people like me with a bit of a technical knowledge to get into it and do the research, verify research independently, and so on. So that is how I've gotten interested, and my work in this and my analysis really started peaking after the Narasimhan 2019 paper came
Mm.
out, because so far we did not have even a single ancient DNA sequence from India or South Asia, and that was the first paper which threw 80-90 samples from Pakistan. Um, and at the same time, the Rupkund paper from the Rupkund lake remains in Uttarakhand came out in 2019.
Mhm.
Uh, so, at, so for the first time, we had some ancient DNA from India, and I thought this is just my curious mind wanted me to analyze all these samples in as much depth as possible. So that is how I got into this.
All right, that's very interesting, especially because yes, 23andMe and a lot of these genetic sequencing organizations have done really well, but then securing into Narasimhan, because that's the we don't have a lot of genetic information about Indian ancestry as much, and Narasimhan et al. The paper did give us a lot of insight. However, that insight is quite fraught with political debates and debates, especially regarding whether the invasions happened or all of that. So, can you laid out in the simplest of terms as to what the genetic evidence provides, as well as what the paper actually posits that it does provide. Is it reaching too far in providing that sort of information, or is the genetics just something to be included in analysis like yours?
Um, the Harvard University and the researchers from Harvard, which were the lead authors of the Narasimhan paper, they work closely with archaeologists and linguists, and they try to prove or disprove one or the other of the theories already provided to them by either linguists or archaeologists. So there were already theories proposed that the steppe people were the Antonovo people, the steppe people were the ones who got Indo-Iranian languages into the regions of South Asia, India, Iran. And with this paper in the Swat Suvastu Valley samples from Pakistan, 1000 BCE, what they found was some 15% steppe ancestry um, in those Suvastu locals. And basically, based on that, what they claim is that we have proven that steppe ancestry entered South Asia prior to 1000 BCE. They give a date of around 1600 or 1500 BCE. Um, and this proves the existing theory that the steppe people gave the languages to the Indian and Iranian regions. Uh, so this is their claim. The problem with the claim is that we already knew people who knew Indian genetics before that. So we have modern samples from India. We knew that there is steppe ancestry in Indians. So we knew that we can expect steppe ancestry in Suvastu Valley. I knew that. The question was how much. Does it point to a large scale invasion, complete replacement, at least half replacement of the population, or because actually, if that would have happened, it would have been a clear indicator that there was large scale replacement, and then a language replacement becomes very possible. So I was expecting that. I was also expecting a lot of the R1A Y haplogroup, paternal Y haplogroup in those samples from Suvastu Valley, which correspond to a male mediated steppe migration, because only males can do war and only males can effect such a large scale language change in a highly populated, densely populated region. But the reality from the data when it appeared was that the it was just it looked like a minor migration, 15% ancestry between 10 and 20% on average, and absolute almost complete dearth of the male step marker, which is R1A. We only find two in 45 male samples from Suvastu Valley. So, which means that the 15% autosomal ancestry in the samples that we found was primarily mediated through females, through the mothers of those samples. Because step, all of them are 100% of the step males in ancient DNA have R1. So, so that makes it actually very easy for us to, a bit easier for us to figure out at least the paternal and maternal ancestries of ancient DNA. So if there was a large scale migration from steppe, male migration, we would have seen a lot of R1A in those Suvastu samples, but that's not there. And secondly, the percentage is quite small. It's not a complete replacement at all. It's just a migration and looks like assimilation. How that can amount to complete language replacement in those regions is not adequately explained by the data. So the claims that they are making, so the data that we were awaiting this data for so long, it was so important to us, uh, did really not show an invasion scenario, neither a male mediated invasion scenario. So until further ancient DNA comes out, this paper actually does not prove a language change. I mean, to go from 15% ancestry change in SUAS to saying that 15% ancestry caused complete language shift is not any. I mean, I haven't seen anything in science to support that.
That's a very interesting point. I'll just come to that, but just to sort of offer a counter for the viewers to, play around with and have both sides of an argument as such. I'm just going to ask that there are a couple of different models when it comes to, such sort of invasion. Now, what is also posited is the migration theory, right? So in a migration scenario, any sort of population would come in with both males and females, and that's actually seen throughout history as well when smaller scale migrations happen, especially in say lesser populated areas. It occurs with both genders coming in, and so is it likely that even though it's a female mediated genetic carry forward replacement of sorts, is it possible that it was more of a migration and settling down of populations and intermixing?
Well, I mean, migration happened, that's for sure. So we see
Yeah.
15% steppe ancestry in Swat Valley, which probably in 2000 BC was not present there. So there is migration, and that migration, what we actually see from the samples is mostly through females, say 60,
Yeah.
70% or so. Now, whether that can translate into complete replacement of language over time is a question that genetics cannot answer.
Sure.
Uh, I um, I don't think. I mean, archaeology should be able to sort of even I don't even know if archaeology or linguistics can answer that question. I mean, but what we can say is that in Europe, when Indo-European languages spread to Europe, the population replacement was to the extent of 70-80%. So the Yamnaya groups from 3300 to 2800 BCE, they spread throughout Eastern Western Europe and replaced 70-80% of that population. So no, uh, I have a high confidence in saying that this is probably linked to language replacement as well. Because if suddenly 70% of your ancestry is coming from a new population, then maybe the affected language change as well. Whether a 15% population migration can change language, I am not sure. I mean, and people who claim that they are sure that it happened that way, I don't know what evidence they cite to make that claim.
So far, frankly, they don't cite any other evidence except for suggesting that migrations happened. It's a little bit of a, self-fulfilling sort of prophecy in this case. I think the PIE conversation that we've had also has led to that sort of conclusion. To move forward on the fact that 15% did effect a major change, it is suggested that endogamy and a sort of hierarchy formation by that 15% or a small, whatever migrant population was there, uh, you know, they were the Aryans who were the Brahmins, and they used endogamy to sort of force their culture upon an indigenous population. That's a claim that even genetics makes, that endogamy enforced hierarchy, and the hierarchy was to ensure that these migrants or invaders established their cultural and language superiority. How likely is the scenario, or how much can
Well,
genetics tell us?
we do know from genetics that there is endogamy since maybe 500 BC or even earlier. Um, we know this because the difference the we can see clear population bottlenecks between different Indian jatis, even in the same geographical location, and those differences in the genetic drift between these populations is much higher than what you would see in Europe at comparable geographical distances.
Mhm.
So we know that there's endogamy, and we also know that the culture here practiced endogamy. So I mean, we have a clear there's a clear proof of the social practice by way of genetics in the modern Indian population. We know from genetics that endogamy happened. The date when it started can be tentative. They say 500 BCE. I think Priya Moorjani's 2016, if I'm not mistaken, paper says 500 BCE onwards. Endogamy started settling in, but it's not as hard a date as some of the other genetic output of genetic papers. The dating aspect in genetics is still, I'm not very comfortable with taking that as hard fact. They themselves are still trying to optimize it and test those new tools that they're using and so on. Recently, a paper came out in which they were testing out a tool called dates admixture. So the date is uncertain, but we know that there's endogamy, and this is borne out by when Greek historians wrote about India. They saw, I think, in Indica, 7 different castes at that time, farmers and rulers and so on, and they note that there was no intermarriage between these. So all this is borne out by literature as well as by genetics. So that's settled. The question about so this was carried out by all jatis, not just Brahmins. It was throughout the hierarchy. Uh, the Narasimhan paper. So I already told you what the new data tells us from the Narasimhan paper. Any other conclusion made by Narasimhan is based on modern Indian samples. So, for example, there's a conclusion made in the paper that the steppe ancestry is much more related to Brahmins than to other Indians.
Right.
That's one of the conclusions made in the paper. Now, it must be stated that this is not based on any new Indian data. The ancient DNA does not really have any of this stratification because we do not know the jati of those samples. We just treat them as homogeneous. Um, but the claim that Brahmins have a special relation to steppe ancestry, modern Brahmins, is it depends on who you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to the rest of the country, yes, but if you're comparing it with Northwest Indians of all jatis and castes, no. So Brahmins do not have excess steppe ancestry when compared to Northwest Indian jatis of any background, be it scheduled caste or middle caste or upper caste. They are very similar. But if you compare it with the rest of the country, especially South India, then yes, Brahmins do have excess steppe ancestry. What the I mean, it's important to suggest the null hypothesis properly. I mean, we would expect the Vedas tell us that the Vedic people were a northern and northwestern population, right? They did not tell us that they were a southern population. So we would expect Brahmins to have ancestry which is similar to Northwest Indians rather than South Indians, and that is just what the data tells us, that they are very similar and they're sort of indistinguishable from the northwestern population. This is Jats, Rhodes, Khatris, um, and Aroras, Banyas of the northwest India, Pathans. And there are some populations which from northwest India and Pakistan which have much more steppe ancestry than Brahmins by 5-10% more. Um, so the claim that they make is sort of disingenuous in my view. They do not state the null hypothesis properly. So that's my view. I mean, we cannot. There's the data just proves that modern Brahmins and Northwest Indians and Pakistanis are from a similar stock, and which we already knew from the literature itself. So that's that. Uh,
So
so I hope that
Brahmins.
answers the question. Did I leave anything out? Did I?
Yes, I was actually coming to it from less genetic and more pop genetic sort of aspect, where you've seen how corrupted the uh, debates around it get once it comes into popular conversation. So currently the sort of discussion is that Aryans came in and genetics somehow proves that these Brahmins established some sort of cultural superiority through endogamy. Now, what I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that endogamy, hierarchy, and migrations themselves, all three of these have occurred across the world at different times in different historical periods, regions, etc. And no sort of cultural aspect is sort of supposed to be force fitted through any of these, either hierarchy or endogamy or any of this. So is this claim that, the steppe ancestry people came in, established superiority via endogamy, and then offered their, imposed their cultural kit or language kit onto an indigenous population? How is this something that genetics can even prove?
Well, firstly, I mean, there's no proof that the steppe ancestry which came down to India were Brahmins, and especially and only Brahmins. I mean, we
Hmm.
don't know anything about the jati, the caste, or if there was
Hmm.
even anything like jati or caste at that time. There is nothing to prove it. Secondly, literary sources. I mean, the Narasimhan paper. If you just go by their what their conclusions are, is that the steppe ancestry entered the Indian subcontinent around 1600, 1500 BCE.
Hmm.
And their own colleagues' paper says that endogamy set in India post 500 BCE, right? So, I mean, they themselves do not find any direct causal link between steppe ancestry entering India and immediately the society fragmenting into various jatis and castes and so on. So, genetically, there's secondly, from literary sources, we know that the caste endogamy set in after, during, and after the Magadhan period, mostly. So, so I don't think there's any basis to that claim. That firstly, who the steppe people were, of which caste they were, of which jatis they were, is an assumption that people make. The pro IIT folks make an assumption that, of course, that the Sanskrit speakers who came from the steppe have to be Brahmins, but that's predicated on their own assumption of a theory. I mean, there's no real, we haven't even found a single properly admixed ANI sample from India. I mean, we don't really know anything about the genetics or the context of these supposed hypothetical people that we will soon find. People which will have a slightly higher steppe ancestry than what we found in Swat Valley, but there's really nothing genetically or even archaeologically to suggest that steppe is somehow related to endogamy. And I mean, it may happen. Some new data may come out, but as of now, there's no evidence for any of that. It's just a theory, and they just play. The, it suits some people, so that they play on the theory. That's it.
All right. So I'm moving on to ancient ancestral South Indian and ancient ancestral North Indian, complexities of gene diversity. Now, from what I understand, any sort of genetic, like you mentioned, people in Europe are playing around with genetic testing kits and tracing their ancestry back to multiple regions and countries even. So obviously throughout history we have a lot of admixture of genetics happening throughout history, especially considering a very ancient civilization like ours. We would obviously expect that, any geneticist would expect that to happen. What is the basis of this AASI and AANI genes, and is this something that is very apparent? Uh, is this division something that is quite apparent, that there are two very distinct sort of haplogroups that offer this divide in between the northern parts of India and southern parts? Also, does the AASI gene happen in northern India? Is the at all? Like it's supposed to only belong to southern Indians and some tribes, etc. But do we see the AASI genes in the north at all?
Firstly, ANI and ASI construct, ancient North Indian and ancient South Indian, was a theory proposed by David Reich from the Harvard lab, that there were two ancient populations and all of Indian populations can be explained by the admixture between these two groups. It was just a theory which was proposed, and they found some semblance of support for it. But the 2019 Narasimhan paper clearly proves that two sources are not enough to explain Indian diversity. At least three sources are required. And I also have an email exchange with Dr. David Reich, who also says that there are many populations which fail to fit within the two source model, and now we have to do with minimum three sources to explain Indian populations. And I would actually add that there are probably four sources if you consider Eastern Indian populations and the Munda populations, which have an additional Southeast Asian sub additional admixture from Southeast Asia. So at least three or four populations are, and maybe even a fifth population if you consider Tibetan-like ancestry in the mountainous regions and in
Tibetan and
Northeast India.
Indus.
So there are at least three for mainland Indian mainland plain populations of India, and maybe four and five required to explain all the diversity of the Indian population groups. Now, those three ancestries are: one is the Iran-like ancestry, one is the or Onge-like ancestry, which is also called AASI, ancient what is it? Ancient South Indian. I don't know. I don't remember what the other.
Ancient ancestral South Indian.
Ancient and ancestral South Indian. That's the second. The third is the steppe ancestry, which is required to explain lots of Indian groups. Fourth and fifth would be the Southeast Asian Munda-like ancestry, and the fifth would be an East Asian Tibetan slash Han-like like ancestry. So these would be the ancestries required, and of course the two source model is extremely simplistic. This is, but it's not reality. Um, so the people who proposed the two source ANI-SI model themselves have taken it back. Now they're saying minimum three sources are required. So I hope this answers the first part of the question. So there, it's actually a lot of complexity going on, and we don't even have any samples from 5000, 6000 BCE India, because even the ASI ancestry in itself would have a lot of branching and sub branching.
Exactly.
There would have populations which would have moved between, say, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, which would have genetically drifted from each other and would have been isolated from each other and so on. So we still have to learn a lot. The next question was, does the ASI ancestry reach North India? Yes, it does. So all of India has, every person from India has this ASI ancestry, and almost every person in India has the Iranian ancestry. Um, so whether it be Delhi, Kashmir, or whether it be Tamil Nadu, all of them have these two ancestries for sure: Iranian-like ancestry and uh, the ASI ancestry. Now, the Iranian-like ancestry is, they call it that because they don't have more samples, but the ancestry which we have is very similar to what they found from 8000 BCE samples from Zagros Mountains in western Iran. So these people they called from Ganj Dare is the name of the location, and they call them Iran Neolithic populations, and we have an ancestry very similar to it, but it's not that same ancestry. I mean, they were both siblings, you can say, and they had a common ancestor. Where this common ancestor resided could be Afghanistan, could be Punjab, or we don't know because we don't have samples yet. But this admixture between this Iranian-like component in Haryana, for example, and ASI happened between 4500 and 5000 to 4000 BCE in Haryana, in the Indus Valley population. That's just an estimate. We could be off by 500 years or so. So this combined ancestry is present in most of Indians, and it's very old, 5,000, 7,000 years old. Uh, so so yes, ASI is present everywhere in all Indians, and so is Iran-like
And
ancestry. Only the proportions differ. North will have more Iran-like ancestry, and South will have more ASI-like ancestry.
okay, just to sort of set context, I got interested in this conversation due to the socio-political connotations of the sciences
Yeah.
used for this. I've never ever seen it applied in any other country, any other region to the extent it's been applied in our politics and social history and discussions in education as well, without having any sort of final, theory. We call it a theory, but it's really a construct and a hypothesis that, like you said, even in the scientific papers, the null hypothesis is not laid out to form the you know final hypothesis as such. So it's not a theory, it's a construct, and I've been interested in the conversation from that perspective. So some of my questions may seem to be coming from a very layperson understanding of how the sciences play into the social political context. So
No,
that's why.
I'm very happy to hear those questions because sometimes, if I'm not grounded, I might be speaking about things which are too technical and not easy to understand. And my aim is to make it more easier for people to understand. So if there is something which you are not able to grasp or the terms that I'm using, please state them. So that
Sure.
I can make it more simpler. The fact of the matter is we just don't know too much about how the genetics plays with the linguistic aspects of it. I mean,
Right.
we cannot say that ASI was Dravidian. We cannot say that. I mean, it could just be that the languages are region specific rather than gene specific. We
Absolutely. That correlation is a little hard to draw when you're on the ground and being bombarded with a lot of information from various sciences, just sort of bolstering one sort of construct, which is the AIT or AMT construct. So, um, yeah. Well, thanks for your consideration on the layperson perspective. I'm just going to move on to a different dig, which is Rakhigarhi. And we have Professor Shinde's paper on that. A lot of the anti-AIT theorists have posited that paper as being proof, conclusive genetic proof that AIT did not happen. However, pro-AIT people say that the timelines clash. I mean, timelines are in conflict. We've never said that AIT happened such a long time ago. Anyway, so what is your take on the evidence provided, and what does it say for Indian populations as such?
So the Rakhigarhi sample is the sample of a woman. So we won't find any Y haplogroups in that. So
Hmm.
we can't find R1A in that because there's no Y chromosome at all. Um, what the Rakhigarhi sample tells us is that it's an admixture between, as I said earlier, an Iranian-like population and an AASI-like population. The sample itself is dated to between 2500 and 2000 BCE. So the Rakhigarhi sample has around, I think, 70% Iran-like ancestry and 30 odd percent AASI-like ancestry. Um, the pro IIT people are correct when they say that uh, this proves that steppe ancestry moved into India post the Rakhigarhi sample
Allegedly.
date because it's not there in Haryana at that time, but it's there now. So somewhere between that sample date and today, the steppe ancestry should have entered. So that's a correct observation.
Mm,
But we already knew that steppe ancestry has entered even before the Narasimhan. The question is not about whether the steppe ancestry entered or not. The question is whether they changed the whole language of the region.
mm,
So, but the people who say that this proves Aryan invasion never happened, they are wrong in the sense that the Rakhigarhi data does actually says that steppe ancestry entered later, post 2000 BC at some point. So, but it does not give any conclusive answer, of course, because this question is ultimately of a linguistic nature rather than a genetic nature.
mm, mm. So,
So that's my
what do you personally find interesting in the Rakhigarhi samples? Was there anything that was unexpected and that was,
This was very
found out?
interesting. Yeah, this was the Rakhigarhi sample was very interesting because there were people like me. So there's a group of the pro. See, I'll tell you what the general thinking of the pro AIT people. The general thinking is that Indus Valley was sort of Dravidian speaking, and the people there were very high in ASI. And around 3000, 4000 BCE, some Iranian ancestry entered and gave them the Dravidian language, and then the steppe ancestry entered and gave them the Indo-Aryan languages. So that is the idea that the pro AIT people have. And they were very adamant. People like Razib Khan on their blog were very adamant that the Rakhigarhi sample will have a lot of AASI. Uh, they were adamant that they'll find a lot of AASI ancestry because, of course, for them, the AIT posits that the dark-skinned Dasyus were killed by the fair-skinned Aryas from the steppe and so on. I was one of the people who said, no, you will find a lot of Iranian ancestry here, and you will not find a lot of ASI ancestry, and that is what we saw. We saw around 75%, 70 to 75% Iranian ancestry and very little ASI ancestry, which strengthens my belief that 4000, 5000 BCE at that time period, Haryana would have been mainly Iranian ancestry like. And slowly we saw a trickle of ASI ancestry coming from the south and mixing with the north. At the same time, some northern ancestry was going down and admixing with the south. But my idea has always been that it is much more likely that by 5000 BCE, northern India was mainly purely Iranian like ancestry, and southern India was mainly ASI ancestry, and in the middle there was a admixture happening, and the admixture region basically, expanded both north and south, and by 2000 BC you had a very admixed population. And this Rakhigarhi DNA does not conclusively prove that, but it does point to the uh, idea that maybe northern India was just Iran ancestry like for a long period of time before ASI ancestry came from the east and south into the north.
Right. So is that a chance that migrations happened from Iran at that time? It's not the Steppe ancestry we're talking about, which happened much later. So we assume that a lot of the migration happened from Iran towards northern India, and that they were the first settlers. I know you have a map, and I'd love for you to sort of trace.
Yeah, yeah, I'll show you the map. Can you just share it on the screen?
Sure.
Okay, can you see the map?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so first thing that I would like to show you is the density of the ancient DNA samples that we have from Europe and any part which is not India or Africa or Australia.
Mm.
Basically, northern Eurasia from Western Europe to Eastern Eurasia has a lot of samples, and India really has a dearth uh,
Genetic samples at all.
of samples. So if you can see my pointer,
Mm.
this is the Suvastu Valley, Swat Valley region, from where we have around 80 to 100 samples. I forget the exact number. And the only second data set, ancient DNA we have, is from Rupkund Lake, which is in Uttarakhand
Mm.
somewhere, near the Nanda Devi Parvat area. The Iranian ancestry, which was found, was from Zagros mountain area,
Mm.
which is somewhere around here, south of the Caspian Sea in western Iran.
Mm.
So this is 8000 BCE. We find samples here, and the Indian Iranian ancestry is related to this ancestry found from western Iran, but
Oh,
it's completely different, and they split 10,000 before 10,000 BCE and maybe even 15,000 BCE. We
wow.
know for sure that it split before 10,000 BCE, but we don't have a date for the prior to that. We don't have
Mm.
tools to determine that. So they had a common ancestor.
Mhm.
Now, where was this common ancestor? We don't know. And when did it move into South Asian regions? Also, we don't know
I
because we
see. I
just
see.
don't have samples that old. So this whole region from here to this whole region, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, have a lot of this Iranian related ancestry.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and then there's the Anatolian farmer ancestry from Turkey, which was found around 6000 BCE in Turkey. This makes its way up till Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, but it does not make its way into India.
I see.
So so that's the scene of the Near Eastern to South Asian region. The Iranian ancestry is related to the Western Iranian ancestry, but we don't know where the common ancestor lived and when that common ancestor sent its children to South Asia. We don't know the dates, and we don't know the location from where that happened. It could be that it was just here. It could be that the location was in central Iran somewhere. It could be that the location of the ancestor was somewhere near Turkmenistan. We just don't have an
So,
answer yet.
can if I can just sort of explain what I understand, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Hmm.
What is now found is that there are a lot of samples that have been discovered near the Zagros Mountains in western Iran, and we see that a sibling genetic admixture of sorts is available in the northwestern India, Pakistan, Afghanistan region. We call it the Iranian sample, Iranian ancestry, because it's very similar, not because it necessarily traveled from Iran at this time. We're not sure about the travel. It's just that they are sister sibling genetic mixtures. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And they have a common ancestor at some point.
yeah, we call it that because those are the only sort of pure samples
Hmm.
that we Iranian like samples that we have. We don't have any other samples which are as pure in Iranian ancestry. All the other samples that we have from the Iranian region,
Hmm.
like we have Tepe Hisar here, we have Haji Firuz Chalcolithic 6000 BC around here. Tepe Hisar is around 3500 BC here. Shaher-e-Sokta is here around 3000 BC. All of them have a lot of Anatolian farmer admixed ancestry by that time.
Hmm.
So we call it Iran Neolithic related ancestry in India because it's not related to all these samples which have Anatolian farmer ancestry, but only to these samples which are much older, which we found in Iran, Western Iran at Zagros Mountains. So that is why we call it Iran Neolithic related ancestry. Because if we find an 8000 BC sample in India, which is similar to that, then probably they'll start calling it India Neolithic ancestry or
Got it.
something
Got
like
it.
that.
So it's the dearth of genetic samples available in this region. So I know this is your blog, or is this a genetic?
Yeah, this is my own blog. I basically there are I think around 10,000 ancient DNA samples updated here. Updated here. So, for example, if you want to find
Yeah.
Yamnaya,
Mhm.
so from the Samara region, so we can find all these samples. We can click on them and we can find certain details about them via haplogroup, date, and so on.
Mhm.
And yeah, so we can there is a little bit of filtering that we can do. So I use it because I of course 10,000 samples. 10,000 samples, I can't memorize all of them, so I use it
Sure.
to figure out some stuff.
Just for the users, Ashish's blog is called Genetics. I will be linking it in the description box below. It's got, like Ashish mentioned, 10,000 samples from across the world. And he's done a lot of independent research to try and figure out who belongs where. And like I said, it's a very neutral sort of idea. It's not coming from a framework. It's also not going against a particular framework. It's just sort of stating what is found so far in terms of genetic data only. But Ashish, you also have a map that I think I saw this on your blog. You have a map that traces the migration as we know of it so far, as the evidence suggests so far. Am I correct? You have a map
Yeah,
that traces the
yeah,
travels.
that's for I have a proposed model for pi for PIE.
Uh-huh.
Is this it? Is this the one you
Yes,
were
this is
referring to?
the one I'm talking about. I did come across it, I think, on Twitter previously.
Okay, I'm trying to expand it. Can you see it properly though?
No,
It's too
it's a
small.
little too small.
1 second. Is it a bit better now? Because okay, wait.
Yes, much
What
better.
I
I think if you can just zoom in on the page itself, it should be
yeah, yeah,
easier
yeah,
for.
yeah. I'll just zoom in on the page. That's right.
Yeah, that's quite perfect.
Yeah. So this is a sort of this is the um, I mean, this is also based on some sort of linguistic theories which have already been proposed for the PIE homeland. It's not,
Absolutely independent.
but that did not drive my analysis. So what I basically found was that I write extensively about this in the blog post, is that there's an ancestry called steppe in Neolithic in north of the Caucasus Mountains. Um, so I'm actually wondering how to explain this to you. Could you frame a question about this so that I can answer it specifically, and then we can go on from there?
Sure. I'm just wondering, according to your model, how did the migration happen? From what area did it come into India, and or did it go out of India? And where do we see the last ancestor that we know of?
Right. Okay. So what you see on the screen right here, it relates to events which happened between 6000 and 3500 BCE. So therefore, it will have no mention of steppe ancestry coming into India because
Right.
it's
Later.
1500 BCE. So let's forget about that. Now the question is, what is this steppe ancestry? So the steppe ancestry is first seen in three samples from north of the Caucasus Mountains, dating to around 4200 4300 BCE, at sites called Progress and Vonyuchka. This is basically southern Russia,
Mm, mm,
and they have an equal mix of European hunter-gatherer, which is EHG ancestry, which lived, around this region at this point in time, and something which looks like 50% of EHG, and then there's 50% of something which is like CHG, which is Caucasus hunter-gatherer,
mm.
or Iran Neolithic.
Okay.
But the problem is happening because we don't have enough samples to differentiate whether it's um this Caucasus hunter-gatherer, which is 7800 BCE samples,
Mm,
or whether it's something related to Iran Neolithic, which are 8000 BCE samples.
mm,
So the tools are not really enough to conclusively prove the other 50% exactly what the source is, and we probably don't have the exact source. That is why we can't, get a model which gives a perfect p-value for the answer, stating that this is the exact ancestry which gives the Iranian component to the step in Neolithic. Now, why
Is
is
it
this step?
likely,
Yeah.
sorry, just since you've mentioned tools to determine genetics a couple of times, is it likely that we'll come across them? We'll develop them at, in some time recent, in the recent future?
No, the tools we won't be able to develop, but we do have some tools which can help us differentiate between the various ancestries, and one of those tools is what I have used to come to this solution as well. But what will definitely help us is that more ancient DNA samples are going to come out, and they will fit better and better into this model. So as and when we get more relevant samples, especially from this whole red region,
Mhm.
from between 5000 and 4000, 6000 and 4000 BCE, we have no samples from here. And this is the area that we should be looking at. And I'm pretty sure that when some sample from this region, which is around 5000 BCE, comes out, it will fit perfectly into the steppe Neolithic model. But we don't have that so far. So that's the problem, because this Iran Neolithic ancestry and this CSG ancestry is very different from the ancestry present here in terms of the tools that we use. So these are bad proxies, so that's why the models are not fitting exactly. We need some samples which will fit exactly into the step model, and I propose that this region is that region which will give the samples which will fit perfectly into the step in Neolithic samples.
Okay, so if you can, from what I can tell, according to this model, we see AASI and we see Indian N1 pi, which is Indian Neolithic, as you call it. And both of these come to the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, which would, be the Rakhigarhi and all of the surrounding excavations that have been found. And here as well, and Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, all of these as well, right? And or are those later? So these would be, an admixture of both of these genetic types would be found in the Sindhu-Saraswati region.
So
And
what? Yeah.
yeah.
So what I found is that the most likely source of the Iranian ancestry in the steppe Neolithic samples is the same ancestry which provided its ancestry to the IVC people.
Hmm.
So when I was making this graph model QP using a tool called QP graph, I was explicitly using Shahir Sokta outlier samples, which are also called Indus periphery.
Yep.
So these are the migrant samples from Indus Valley, which were found in eastern Iran. Uh, okay, let me just stay at okay. So Shires of the outlier samples, which are said to be Indus periphery and migrants from the IVC, either first generation or second generation migrants. So any tool you use, it will
Hmm.
actually you actually see affinity between steppe Neolithic samples and Indus Valley samples, and the model fails if that affinity is not adjusted for. So what I have basically found is that there is affinity between this steppe Neolithic ancestry of 4200 BCE and the Indus Valley samples from Shire Sokta, which are basically migrants from IVC into eastern Iran, somewhere around here. And but IVC is not a direct ancestor to steppe Neolithic because it has around 25% ASI ancestry. This AASI ancestry is not present in steppe Neolithic
Sure. So what I
because
can say is that IVC is sort of a mixture of Indian Neolithic and ASI, and Indian Neolithic could have carried to steppe Neolithic, and then there's a lot of mixture from the Caucasian hunter-gatherer, European hunter-gatherer, and then you posit that whatever the missing aspect is the India and gene type, which is not really accounted for yet.
yeah, yeah, because we haven't found any samples yet. So my models basically tell me that this steppe Neolithic is 50% EHG, around 25% CHG, and around 25% India and related ancestry. And this same ancestry further then goes on to provide around 75% ancestry to this Indus Valley civilization, Sindhu Saraswati civilization. So then what I propose is that this is the Pi region, and from here, the Indo-Aryan languages, Indo-Iranian languages spread in this region, this whole region, and not just SSC, but this whole region, Iranian languages as well. And from steppe Neolithic through Yamnaya and related populations, it spread into through corded ware. It's Indo-European languages spread into Western Europe. So that's the model. It's similar, and this location is by linguists has been proposed by I think mainly Joanna Nichols,
Hmm.
and there's recently also Alexander, what's his name?
I
Uh,
know who you're talking about. Joanna Nichols had to sort of, even though genetics said that she had to withdraw her findings and sort of suggest that it moved the other way around, is
it's confusing. I mean,
she did initially posit this, but then she had to retract her.
she has retracted it. Yes, that's true. But it makes a lot of sense. And there are other people who have used her now retracted model and said that this also makes a lot of sense. For example, just a second, Alexander. What is his last name? Alexander Kozintsev has a good paper on it in which he supports. Uh, he's from St. Petersburg University and he supports the sort of Bactrian and South Central Asian
Mhm.
pi model. And that's based partly on Joanna Nichols' work as well. But
I see.
I'm not saying that bacteria, I mean, I'm not really sure. I'm not going to pinpoint which exact region it was because we don't have genetically, I don't have any samples to, say exactly where it was from. If, for example, we find a sample from, say, just next to the Caspian Sea, and it fits exactly into this model, then probably I'll say that from just east of Caspian, 5000 BC, we had pi. You know,
Okay.
so
Uh,
it all depends based on new samples and when they'll come out.
all right. I'm just again very. You might find this a very basic question, but I'm just going to ask for those who posit the out of India theory. Is it possible that you have this in the Saraswati civilization and then you have the India Neolithic, and at some point the SSC gene type sort of separated and went outward towards India N1, or is the Central Asian, or was there a spread of India N1 towards the western parts, and did it necessarily go from India N1 to SSC only?
So this India N1, I have actually written it here. Um, the actual location of India N1 and ASI is unknown due to lack of ancient samples. India N1 is most likely to be found in Iran, northwest Indian subcontinent, or South Central Asia, or anywhere in between those regions. So because we don't have, so this model is based on genetics. So I find that that the component required is related to Sindhu Saraswati civilization.
Hmm.
It is my guess that it is present, that this India N1 would have been present somewhere in this large region, and I refuse to pinpoint an exact location. It
Right.
could be within, it could be actually inside the ancestors of Sindhu
Hmm.
Saraswati civilization as well. Around 5000 BC, at that time it was known. I mean, IVC had not yet started,
Yes.
but it's possible that that this ancestry was actually present on top of this orange uh, bubble that I've drawn. We just don't know. But what I do know is that the likelihood that it was present in this very large region and somewhere
Hmm.
here is extremely high.
Hmm.
And once we get more samples, we can start pinpointing it better.
All right.
But what is extremely clear is that there's some sort of affinity between steppe Neolithic and Indus Valley samples, which is more. I mean, even if I provide Iran and CHG as source for steppe Neolithic, this need for affinity with Indus Valley does not resolve. If I tried giving a source as Iran Neolithic, which is just a second. Uh, I have tried many models for steppe Neolithic. I have tried giving it only CHG. Even then, it tells me that there is some affinity which with IVC populations which needs to be resolved. I've given it both CHG as well as Iran Neolithic ancestry, but it then still tells me that there is affinity with India with IVC samples which need to be resolved. Only when I add something like India N1 is the affinity resolved.
Okay,
Now,
I just remembered something that comes from the PIE, the linguistics conversation itself. A scholar called Asko Parpola has a little bit of an extreme theory. He suggests that even the so-called Dravidian population, the IVC population, came in from the steppes in a prior migration. So what you're suggesting is, the correlation between the India N1 and the steppe Neolithic populations. If we reverse it and we suggest that steppe Neolithic was somehow even 5000 BC, came into India in a first wave and then went to Sindhu Saraswati and sort of intermixed with AASI. How possible is that, and why is it? If not, then why is it not possible?
genetically, it's impossible. Genetically, it's
Okay.
not possible at all because there are only two samples there are only two ancestries in Rakhigarhi, and maybe a third a minor ancestry.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
uh, and
Right.
there is no steppe ancestry in Rakhigarhi samples or any of the Indus periphery samples. So the steppe ancestry from does not enter India before 1600 BCE, and my hypothesis is that mainland India, Haryana, and regions you will not find steppe ancestry until even 1000 BCE. I think it just enters much later, but of course samples will tell us exact dates. But if we find 1000 BCE dates from Haryana, I don't think we'll find a lot of steppe ancestry, maybe 5% or so. I think a bulk of the steppe ancestry in modern Indians is later than 1000 BCE, which makes,
Got
in my mind, it unrelated to language change in India.
it. Right. So, very different. I think at least I get the gist of the model. It's quite clear to me. So,
Let me just speak a little about the steppe ancestry itself and how it spread into Europe. So this steppe ancestry, the building block of it is this steppe Neolithic, which is 50% EHG and 50% a combination of CHG and India in one.
mhm,
And from then on, with some additional admixture of minor admixture, about 20% from other ancestries in Europe, uh, cultures like globular amphora or Triphylia or one or the other, some Ukrainian or Polish culture, you form Yamnaya like ancestry, which basically is 80% steppe and 20% some other local ancestries. And this culture, Yamnaya culture, is between 3300 and 2800 BCE.
mhm.
At the same time, there's also something called steppe makeup cultures, which are present somewhere around here. Makeup is somewhere around this region in Yamnaya itself, and which also had wheel technologies. And it's supposed that Yamnaya borrowed these wheeled technologies from the makeup people. It's a bit interesting that Makop has archaeological links with Afghanistan, in which lapis lazuli and some other
You see.
such decorative ornaments have been found, which can only be for South Asian provenance, Afghanistan mines of lapis lazuli,
Yes.
and Ivanova is one of the archaeologists who has written a very good paper on the southern and southeastern links between steppe Makop and South Asia, especially Afghanistan region. Then there are some in Makeup you find some empty DNA which is M49, which is Indian specific, and then you also find some three samples which are two or three samples which are haplogroup L, which also point to possible links with India. Although the autosomal ancestry of these regions, autosomal ancestry does not show much of an India link, but the parental markers do show a link.
How long ago is this from? What timeline are we talking about?
So Yamnaya and Steppe Mycop are around 3500 to 2700 BCE. Steppe Mycop ancestry culture would be around 3500 to 3000 BCE. And this India into Steppe Neolithic is around 4500 BCE. So these are basically different possibly migrations, um, but it points to genetic link between these two regions and also some archaeological and trade links between these two regions.
Right, that's quite interesting that before the Aryan invasion theory, the timelines of it, we see that there was some sort of trade between at least regions of Afghanistan into the steppe regions and the
Yeah.
Russian.
For anyone
Uh,
who's interested in this, they could look up Maria Ivanova and her paper on the Caucasus region. Uh,
I'll try to link it in the description box below as well, so they can refer to it immediately.
right.
That that's quite interesting.
Apa-
Uh,
apart from apart from that, linguistically also there are links between there are a lot of loan words which are found from old Indo-Aryan into Eastern Caucasian languages,
I
and
think
these
Belyayev has a theory on that, that even the so-called Dravidian languages find, the language family finds some sort of cognates there as well. It's not just the Indo-Aryan, Indo-European language families.
right. I believe I did not. I mean, I believe he says that Dravidian is one of the oldest families to branch off from Indo-European. Is that correct? I'm not
Uh, Yeah, I'm not sure about that. He posited them as adstratums, is what I understood from Amritanshu's explanation on that. That they are siblings, not one on top of the other. So basically, they
Right.
branched off early. Yes, yes. So yes, you're correct that if the PIE theory holds, then Indo-Aryan and Dravidian were basically sister languages, and you can find tone cognates of Dravidian language in that region as well.
Right. So,
Yes.
so on that basis, I guess he says that Northwest India would be the Pi region. Is that correct?
Sort of. Yes. Yes.
Right. And yeah, so for this route which I'm suggesting from for India and into the steppe region, what I was saying is that there are a lot of old Indian loanwords, old Indo-Aryan loanwords in Eastern Caucasian languages as well. And these loanwords are very interestingly much older than the loanwords found in the Finno-Ugric languages, um, which are languages found somewhere here in this region, and so which basically fits well with the timeline that I've suggested, uh, because the contacts with this region was much later. Iranian languages came in contact with this region much later. Uh,
It would be very interesting to see a superimposition of the linguistic model, the different linguistic models, not just PIE and AIT, along with this genetic modeling. And either a comparison or a superimposition. Maybe a superimposition would make it a little too complicated to understand, but that would be interesting to view. And then, of course, we can have the archaeological models also
yeah, the
done.
pi is basically just it's a linguistic question, primarily, and genetics I think should just I'm actually in two minds whether to give primacy to linguistics or not, because so I'm not really sure, because it seems that nothing can be uh, you know there's no for 200 years there has been no solution based on linguistics.
Actually, that's not true, Ashish. From what I understand, there has been a lot of there is a solution. It's just not being accepted due to it not fitting the previously posited model. I think Shrikant Talageri's work suggests that the words for the flora and fauna travel from the Ganges Valley outward towards the northwestern part, towards
Hmm.
Saraswati Valley regions. It's there. There has been no counter to it. So linguistically, that's not a model that's holding anymore, which is why archaeology and genetics got pulled into the conversation. However, in terms of the modeling, I was just suggesting for an audience that may be interested, it would be interesting to see all of the genetics, the linguistics, and the archaeological model that is more neutral in nature, not driven solely by AIT frameworks, be superimposed to understand if that's a theory that holds.
There's another very interesting model provided by Ivanov and Gamri kids, so something like, I don't remember his name correctly.
Mhm.
Paul Hegarty is one of them. Ivanov and Gamkrelidze is the other, and they
Mm.
basically posit a Near Eastern Pi, which is around Armenia, this region.
Mhm.
Um, Basically now almost everyone is rejecting the step model for pi. This region is no longer the choice of the original pi homeland, pi homeland. This is because in Anatolia, where Hittite has been attested, there is no trace of steppe ancestry to be found even till 1500 BCE
Wow.
in this region. Uh,
Mhm.
so this is the reason that people are moving away from the step as pi model and moving in a more southerly direction to the Near Eastern model, which is basically Max Planck's model and supported by linguists like Paul Hegarty and Jena Institute and so on. And this is a much better model in my opinion, because than the step model, because at least it provides some explanation for the Anatolian languages, because after 6000 BC, around 5000 4000 BC, we see 50% ancestry from this region going into Anatolia.
I see.
So at least it explains Anatolian, where steppe is completely absent. And then this region, of course, also somewhere in this region, according to them, also gives the 50% ancestry to steppe in Neolithic, and from there European languages can be explained. Of course, Tocharian, which is basically found in the Tarim Basin here, this is the region for the Tocharian
Mm,
language, remains sort of a mystery. And I
yes.
think so far, apart from the Joanna and Nichols and my model, which is similar to that model, at
Mm,
least it's proximal to the Tarim Basin and can explain the early split of Tocharian. And so the main problems have always been this Tocharian and Anatolian, and how to explain them, because they are so wide apart. Um, so I mean, I don't support. I support the Near Eastern model only to the extent that it's much better than the step model. Of course, my own model, I think that this region, this whole big region here somewhere, is the pi, somewhere around 5000 BC.
Uh, okay. I'm going to move outside this model and just sort of, or actually, you can keep it on. Where does
No,
the
you can remove it. That's fine.
no no okay, let me just remove it, and you let me know if we needed to explain.
Right.
Where do we see the evidence, the genetic evidence of the Mittani woman? That I think you mentioned Razib Khan. He had suggested that she's a highborn, woman, and how does that fit into the debate
I
of?
don't know. I don't know what he's talking about. There was one woman who was found in the Alalak well, and she was found dumped inside a well. I mean, that's all the
I
context
actually
there
did
is.
see the images. Yes, yes.
So, and this woman is somewhere from the Bactriana Margiana complex region, because she has some ancestry from there. But it does not. Uh, I mean, see, there are ways to do science. First, you identify the sample, the skeleton, and you identify the context of the skeleton. Now, if the archaeological context of the skeleton tells you that, this is probably a Mittani woman, then you analyze the genetics of it and find out, okay, we know from archaeology that this is a Mittani woman. And now the genetics will tell us where this woman was from. So now we have the genetic profile of a Mittani.
Mm, mm.
What these people do is that they first see the genetics of the person, and then based on what's convenient to that genetics, they decide who the sample and the skeleton belong to.
So it's sort of the opposite of what should be done.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be a grounding, right? I mean, you can't. So wherever the step ancestry travels, you can't say, oh, 10% step ancestry found there. Oh, they must have spoken some.
Oh, but that's
You know,
exactly what is posited, right? And in common parlance, that is exactly how it's done. That there is some
yeah,
amount of step ancestry, so everything is. It's a very
this is
simplistic
what that
model.
OC 6% of step ancestry is found. So they must have spoken some Indo-European language or family or something. I mean, that's just stupid.
Right.
That's not science. And in this, in the case of the Mittani woman, there is no Mittani sample. I mean,
I see.
he they posit that the sample is Mittani because they think that they have found some step ancestry there.
Okay.
The model themselves, there are multiple models which fit that sample. I think what they are talking about is there are three outliers from Anatolian region. One is the Alalak well woman from the location of Alalak, and she was found in
Mm.
a well, probably murdered for some reason, and we have no idea who she was. We know that she came from the Bactriana Margiana region, but there's nothing else to tell us who she was. Um, and there was no step ancestry in that sample. It's She's just a more eastern migrant, or for what purpose she was there, we have no clue. The second samples are from Megiddo, which is in the Levant region. I think Megiddo is in Israel, and
Mm.
there are two siblings who are buried, and they have some semblance of a step ancestry from Sintashta. But I have modeled it, and I have found it to be from Catacomb as well, which is just north of the Caucasus Mountains, from the Catacomb culture. So there are multiple models which fit those children, and there is nothing in the context, archaeological context of those samples which proves that they were Mittani migrants. I mean, so what the people who want them to be Mittanis are doing is that they're saying, "Oh, look, there is steppe ancestry there, so they must be Mittani." This is it is not grounded by any other by not supported by archaeology. Archaeology should first tell us we have found definite features of a Mittani person based on the grave goods or some other context, and then we should analyze the genes of the ancestry of those samples, and then we should make conclusions based on that. Just to prove a model, we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Okay. Now, completely different question, but okay, still has to do with females. But how do this entire R1A sort of the steppe ancestry model is based on male genetics, but there's also some female genetics involved. How do those play in? Do they sort of go against the grain of the Aryan invasion theory in this case, or what do they prove?
Yeah, so the Swat Valley samples showed around 15-20%, if I remember correctly, samples having European mtDNA on the X chromosome. Um, the samples basically said that the steppe ancestry in the SWOT sample is through
Female.
females from the steppe. This is completely opposed to, as I said earlier, this is completely opposed to the theory that there was a male mediated migration. Even if you don't say
Yes.
it's invasion, male mediated migration, which is not supported by the samples that we have from Swat Valley. Even the Rupkund samples, I think we have 23 Indian samples from Rupkund dated to around 850 CE. The highest step samples there are not R1A, they are J2A, I think. And so even those samples did not have the step ancestry mediated by stepfathers, uh, right? Because step was 100% R1A. If
Mm,
if there was continual paternal descent, father to
mm.
son to son to son to son, we would have seen R1A in those high step samples, which means that the father was, of course, J2A, not related to step, and the high step ancestry probably came from the mother's side, autosomally. Um,
I see.
right.
Uh,
So that's why the 100% R1A nature of step makes analysis, a lot easier. Because if it was 50% this, 50% that, then it would have become tougher. But even in Rupkund samples, only two are R1A, and surprisingly, none of them have step ancestry. It does not prove anything as such, but it just stood out like a shocker to me because now we have two sets of ancient DNA, one from Swat Valley and one from Rupkund. Both have
mm.
an extreme dearth of R1A, and in both you do not see the highest um, step ancestry samples associated with R1A.
So again, the Rupkondia, it did have some R1A, right? So what does that say? Does it say that there's a small amount of admixture there, or what? What is
It
the
would.
conclusion that can be
And let me ask you a question.
drawn?
Let me ask you a counter question. I'll tell you the data and then I'll ask you to infer from that.
Sure.
So there are 23 Indian samples from Rupkund.
Mm.
Out of that, I think, if I remember correctly, I have a blog post on that, but around 10 to 13 of them are males. And only so if I arrange them by step ancestry in a descending order, the topmost being the highest step ancestry and lowest samples being the lowest
Without.
step ancestry. The R1A is only present in the bottom two samples.
Oh wow!
So what do you
I
infer
see.
from that?
Well, yeah, that just that's putting me in the spotlight, and that's yeah, that's something that I should not jump to. But obviously, I mean, it seems a little obvious what that should mean. So that's extremely interesting. Huh. And
So, I mean, if step ancestry was so much correlated with R1A,
right,
and this keep it in mind that Rupkund had this is basically a random set of skeletons that we found.
right.
They were probably there because of either accident or probably they were doing some tapasya until death, either of those two things. And they're
Mhm.
essentially, I guess, a group of unrelated people. They are not brothers, sisters,
I
sons,
see.
daughters there. We have identified that from their genetics. They're not related to each other. So we have a very random set of samples
Mhm.
which is representative of the whole of India, because if you plot them on a PCA chart, we can see that they range from South Indian tribals to Maratha-like ancestry to Brahmins, and some even to Jats and Pakistani sort of ancestry. So we have a random group of people there. It's like a perfect double-blind sort of a trial, and there you see that the topmost step ancestry samples do not have R1A. The only two samples which have R1A have zero step ancestry. It does not
So
prove
how
anything to
do
me.
we
It just puts
how
into
do we
question,
correlate step ancestry to R1A at this point?
because
Like since you make that
because
point.
the step samples which we have found from ancient DNA are all R1A. They actually are R1A. Although they are of a different kind of R1A, they are Z2121
Yes.
variety. Uh, they are different from what we normally find in India. So there are different
That
kinds. So that's another question that we should actually get into.
that seems
Uh,
to be quite a conclusive sort of, evidence in terms of the genetic aspect of this discussion. No? Is there a reason that it's not very conclusive?
yeah, because we just don't have enough data, and they are the pro AIT side is jumping to conclusions very prematurely, in my opinion.
No, so is the Rupkund excavation not really considered when we discuss the genetic question? Because again, how do we correlate this R1A to step ancestry when the ones with most step ancestry don't have any R1A? So
In the
this
Rupkund sample, now the people will question the Rupkund sample is not representative. It's just a small set of samples. It's just by chance and by luck that this happened to be the case. These
well,
are the
that's
sort of.
that's the case with all of the samples, right? It is by chance that we come upon
Yeah, they said the
Rupkund.
same thing about so the pro IT crowd said the same thing about Swat samples. They said that Swat is not really Indo-Aryan region. It was just it's a mountainous region. It has only very little to do with the Indo-Aryan culture, and it was sort of on the outskirts of the Indo-Aryan culture. So you won't really expect to find much R1A there. But if we actually sample the plains, then we'll find a lot of R1A. These are so when the data comes out, these are they have to explain their position. When it doesn't suit them, they have to start giving some sort of explanations. Uh, I
Okay,
myself
so
am actually not. Uh, it's actually it's a very complex situation. I mean, it's not that one person like me has answers to all of these things. We just need a lot more data to make sense of what actually happened. Simplistic scenarios presented by AMT people do not cut it, and they don't explain a lot of things. And let's not be premature in making conclusions. What happens if we sample a lot of India and find that step ancestry enters Punjab, Haryana only in 800 BCE? We don't even know exactly when it enters the Indian population. What happens if it enters only 800 BCE? Does it still is the AMT model um is it still viable then? Of course, it won't be, because that's too late for any Vedic
mm,
era people.
mm,
So I showed all the viewers the complete lack of samples in India and compare it with Europe, where everything is much more clearer. We
yes,
just
yes.
don't have enough samples. I don't know why people are so hell bent on jumping to conclusions.
All right, but let's go back to the Swat Valley samples, and let's have that same inference drawn from the mitochondrial DNA aspect.
So mitochondrial DNA in SWOT samples, we found I think T1A1 T1A1 was the step marker which we found in the SWOT Valley samples. I think around 15-20% were T1A1 and one other European mtDNA marker, which basically told the researchers, and they correctly concluded that this migration was likely due to female mediation. Uh, Now the question is, what explains what was happening at that point in when we consider sociopolitics. I don't know. Maybe they were just friendly tribes who were exchanging daughters with each other to strengthen their ties. I have no idea, but this is what we see from the data, that the step ancestry at least in SWOT samples is mediated via females.
That's quite
Similarly,
interesting. Yeah.
Similarly,
But
even in Northwest India, there was recently a paper out about which analyzed modern Indians from Northwest Indian regions, and Brahmins had 15% mtDNA from Europe, and maybe around even 20-25% more maternal ancestry from an from Iranians. So um, there's this maternal mtDNA connection between Europe, Iran, and India also, which I believe is not discussed as much as RNA is.
that's obviously the inference that is going on in my head. I think if a layperson can also connect those dots, then there's a reason that it's not as discussed. Uh, because obviously, if it's female mediated, transfer of genes, then that means either they were, maybe there was slave trading, maybe there was just a lot of intermixing and alliances, like you suggested. Uh, but yeah, it definitely does not indicate any sort of invasion or imposition of anything.
Um,
So that
you asked earlier, why is invasion important and why can't it be migration? Because in my mind, such a large scale complete replacement of languages from Pakistan, Haryana, Punjab, Gujarat, all these regions, without leaving a trace of the hypothesized substrate languages, requires a large scale population replacement. I mean, there is no other way to explain it. You can't have 15% population coming in and then slowly changing the tongues of all the other people and not expecting them to carry on in some way or the other the grammars and the features of the original languages spoken. But
so
there is
this is
no.
something that happened in the European regions, right? When we discussed steppe ancestry and how they moved into the Western Europe. So that's what happened. Like you said, 70%
Yeah, there's a
gene.
lot of yes, there's a lot of population replacement in Europe, but it's not comparable to India. I mean, even Harvard Lab and Dr. Reich, they acknowledge this fact that the percentage and the population turnover in the Indian subcontinent is not comparable to um, the situation in Europe at all. They also acknowledge the fact that there's no archaeological evidence to show any change in culture on the arrival of the so-called steppe Aryans. But then they say that it doesn't matter because these all evidences are trumped by the fact that there's a genetic connection and it fits beautifully into all the other theories that we have. So then that is why it makes sense to them.
But a genetic connection does not correlate to a genetic imposition or genetic top-down approach that is posited, right? A sibling sort of idea is not the same as what the Aryan invasion theory posits.
Yeah, I mean the Harvard lab especially, they have a linguistic model that they are working with, and there's a battle sort of going on between them as well as the Max Planck laboratory. The
Mhm.
Max Planck guys sort of follow the Paul Haggerty Near Eastern Pi sort of a model, and the Harvard guys followers of I guess Witzel and David Anthony, and they uh, they have their Kurgan hypothesis. So actually,
Right.
it's a fight between these two people, and we are just caught in the crossfire, I guess. Um,
Mm-hmm.
one posits a Near Eastern pi model, one posits a Kurgan model, and for them it's extremely simple. They see R1A in modern Indians. They see 15, 20, 25% step ancestry in some modern Indians, and they had already said that step probably gave language to India. So that's it. That's enough for them to not think about it twice.
So Witzel also said that they're waiting on more genetic evidence, on yet to be discovered genetic evidence. But to be fair, so is your model, right? Like we are awaiting a lot more genetic evidence to put into the
Yes.
Northwestern Indian pi model. So
What I can say for sure for my model is that there are connection that there is genetic affinity found by tools by when I provide samples, step analytic samples as well as IVC samples to the model. If I don't give IVC as a source to or the ancestor of IVC as a source to step, the model does not work. Even if I give CHG or Iran Neolithic as an ancestry,
mm,
it just does require the India N1 sort of an ancestor of IVC as an additional ancestry. I mean, that is something which is 100% fact. Now the question is where this ancestry was located. That we will know only when we actually sample from a specific latitude and longitude and find that ancestry.
okay. Okay. So now, if we sort of flip that, if we flip exactly that, and we sample IVC or we sample the northwestern Indian population's genetics. So if you fit this into the model, do how likely is it that sorry, not northwestern, just SSC civilization. So how necessary is the step ancestry to that uh, model? Like if you just flip exactly what you're saying for the step Neolithic requiring IVC input, how
Pre 2000 BC North Indian samples have no requirement at all for any step ancestry.
like yes, of course, IVC is much before that anyway.
In
Right.
the models, I can provide them as reference populations. Technically, if I say if we keep step Neolithic in the right populations, which is a reference set, if there is in the model for IVC, uh, so if I give a model IVC equal to Iran plus AASI plus maybe AANI ancestry, which is like some minor Siberian ancestry, and if I put step Neolithic in the reference populations, if there was a need for step Neolithic ancestry, this model would have failed, and in the output of the model, I would have seen that it's failing because there is affinity which is there with step Neolithic, which my model is not does not address.
Right. Right.
But that is not the case. Whereas that is the case when I am
Yeah.
trying to model step
Step.
Neolithic. I am giving variety of sources from Iran to CHG. They are not working. It's requiring something bit more eastern, and
Mm,
that profile is only to be found somewhere east of Caspian.
got it. Got it. All right. I would actually love to have you on to discuss a particular article on your blog at a later date, maybe next month if you can make the time. I'd love to have you on again. And another thing that I I'm having a little trouble framing this. Uh, let's just go generic in terms of this question of how linked linguistics and genetics are at this point. If you're not functioning from the PIE model, what does all of this data say?
Um, that's a very hard question to answer because see, we have to assume that I mean, there's a hidden assumption in all our discussion so far is that Indian languages and European languages are connected and are
Hmm.
related in some way at least, right? Um, I mean, I basically operate on this assumption. Now, if this assumption is not true, then I've been
No,
like wasting.
of course, that assumption is already established. That is true. Uh,
Right.
all right. So maybe I should just the migration model that you're working for or against or with or without. How does it hold in terms of the genetics model so far? Does it
Okay,
count or?
okay. For, let me just state it this way. In India, there are only two broad ancestry categories in ancient and modern Indians, which are related to external people outside of South Asia. One is the steppe ancestry, and one is the Iran-like ancestry. So, if there is any genetic connection based on which languages spread, it is either of these two components which are responsible for it. Now, these are all hypotheses and assumptions, you know. So let's just to say that those assumptions are true. So now, if step ancestry does not enter India, let's say we find samples and it doesn't enter India by 1000 BC and it enters at around 800 BC. You know, just because it entered in Swat Valley in 1500 BC does not mean that it entered further inside, right? We don't have proof for it yet.
I see.
We need actual samples and actual carbon dated samples so that we have proof. Now, suppose that doesn't happen. Suppose step only enters by 800 BC, and we can prove it by having various samples across various dates, and we can see increased step ancestry only after a particular date. Then the only option left is the Iran-like ancestry being the common link, right?
Okay.
And
Got it.
we know that the Anatolian ancestry does not have step component, and we know that Anatolian is one of the first branches to
Separate.
consensus to get to split off from the common proto language. So then this Iran component becomes extreme. The becomes a big player in this whole genetic and linguistic aspect, and
Right.
it's not like there are not people who have proposed Iran as a homeland. There are
Homeland.
many who have.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So we just
I don't actually know if I answered a question, but
it
it
does, it
was a
does.
difficult.
So that makes the homeland likely either northwestern India or Iran. So and in terms of language, I will say this again. Amrit is somebody he's who I've spoken with on this channel, so I'm just going to cite him. Of course, the information is out there for others as well, from others as well. The fact is that Iran actually talks about Dahae, which is the Dasa, as their own
Yes.
peoples at the same time, right? So now this was much before uh, Aryan invasion or migration is posited. It's a very far off timeline from that. It's
There
a
is a
couple of
region called there is a region called Dagestan east of the Caspian Sea,
right,
and
right. That is
Dagestan and Strabo. I think the Greek writer Strabo mentions the Dahe as people from this South Central Asian region, and these I guess are the same people who are the Dasas or the Dahe or the Dasyus that we find in the Rig Veda. I think Parpola proposes this. I think even Witzel is sort of in agreement that the Dasyus were a Iranian sort of an east of Caspian people. And I think the Avesta also mentions the homeland, and the homeland, I guess, I believe that the consensus is that it's somewhere in the Hindu Kush.
so now. If they propose that the Dasas were also, Iranian, and is it positive that they migrated again? Is this the first migration that occurred from Iran into India, and that is the settlement of the Dasas, and then the Steppe people came in, and basically there's no indigenous population except the folks carrying a lot of AASI and speaking the Dravidian language,
Uh, See, for the
according
some
to
South
this model.
South Central Asian region and Eastern Iran, the problem is that we don't have samples older than 3300 3500 BCE. So how the Iranian ancestry spread in these regions is a sort of a mystery. I assume that it was present there since 10,000 BCE. but we don't have actual samples to know how the ancestry spread there. But if say in 2000 BC we are talking about South Central Asians as Dahae people, the people Dahae or Dasyus, there's no steppe ancestry there. There's only Iranian ancestry, a bit of Anatolian farmer ancestry from the Near
Sure.
East, and some AANI ancestry from Tarim Basin, China, or from somewhere in Siberia. Maybe 10-15% of that. So these are the only ancestries which are present in South Central Asia at this time. Um, so uh, there are other archaeologists also, like for example, Victor Saryanidhi is the excavator of the Bactria margina complex. He's the excavator of Gonur. Um, he has very clearly posited that the BMAC, BMAC is Iranian.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yes.
and from genetics, we see that there's absolutely minimal step genetic influence in the Bactriana margina sample, still even 1500 BCE. So, I mean, the science on this is clearly not settled. There are archaeologically, there are many reasons. There are fire temples in Zarkutan and Sapali Tepe and Gonur. Fire worship is a big part of the culture of the Vedic people, and I would presume even the of the Iranians. This fire
Iranians.
worship is not to be seen anywhere in the steppe
Hmm.
at this time, around 2200, 2100 BCE. So there is a very good reason to consider even the South Central Asians and the Bactriana Marjana people to already be Iranian speakers at this point in time, given archaeology and their um, fire ritual practices. Uh, in Bustan, there's a cemetery called Bustan, and there are samples which are analyzed from 1600, 1700 BCE. And archaeologically in the Bustan necropolis, they have found multiple, three fires, which some archaeologists have linked to the three fires of the Vedic ritual, uh, especially used in the Griha Sutra manuals and so on. And at this point in Bustan, there is no steppe genetic influence. So
Of
there
course.
are various indications of Aryan or Iranian culture already present in this region without any genetic influence from steppe ancestry at all.
That ancestry. Right. Right. So that's very interesting. So the all of the cultural markers actually point to Iran rather than to steppe anyway. Outside of India, even if it's outside of India, it's to Iran, not to the steppe region at
Exactly,
all.
exactly.
Yeah.
My actually first point of right now, I'm solely focused on disproving completely steppe as the progenitors of the Indo-Aryan and Indo-Iranian languages.
Hmm.
After that, we can pinpoint exact what location, where
Where?
is it Iran, is it East Iran, is it Punjab, is it Uttar Pradesh? We'll see later.
Right.
The first problem is to pick the easy is low hanging fruit, which is to disprove the step alternative. After that, it's much more difficult to pinpoint exactly where it happened and
Because
what happened.
honestly, none of the evidence lines up to steppe ancestry anyway. One thing is it's too late, and it was the idea of the Aryan migration, Aryan invasion theory was posited much before the IVC excavations happened anyway. So they didn't take into account the fact that something would emerge to disprove this hypothesis. So I think
Yes.
none of the evidence anyway fits because it was made much before the excavations happened. So it's definitely quite a possible thing to do. Now, about your blog, how much of it is similar to and different from Eurogenes?
Before I answer that, let me just plug in my charger because my battery is reducing a bit.
All right.
Yeah, the question was how different is my blog from that of Eurogenes?
Yes. So is it sort of following the same, model? Of course, the samples are, a lot more on that side. So is it sort of influenced by or taken from the Eurogenes model blog?
Well, I no, I basically just blog about whatever I find interesting and which has not been covered, and especially the South Central Asian and Indian samples, which see a lot less coverage, and critical analysis and modeling of those samples is much less. So whatever I found interesting, basically I blog about that, not following any specific model as such. It's actually been many days since I have blogged, since I made a new post because I have not found anything very significant to write about. I have a few topics in mind, but Davidsky from Eurogenes basically does not write long form analysis. His usual posts are very short, and
I've seen them as counters to a lot of the mainstream articles. So of late, that's been a sort of style that this is what this article writes and this is why it's wrong. So
yeah, because the narrative is shifting from his side now, and he's a bit let's say flustered because the mainstream
yeah,
narrative is shifting.
that's the one that I read. That those are the ones that I actually saw on his blog. So.
Yeah, the mainstream narrative is shifting because of the reasons I told you. Anatolian does not have any steppe ancestry, and that is one of the main reasons that people are now moving to the steppe as a secondary homeland for the European languages, and the Armenian Iranian region as the primary homeland from which Anatolians spread first. So and anything outside of Europe for Davidsky is blasphemy. So
So is it? I mean, in India, we've seen how fraught these debates can get. Do you see that same thing happening in Europe at any point? I know that
oh,
the average.
oh, definitely, definitely. You should. I follow all the commenters on those blog on Davidsky's blogs.
I've read some
Uh,
Reddit. I've read there's a lot of pushback even against the out of India theorists in terms of linguistics, and I know the flack that they get. I'm just I've just seen Gene's the blog and the sort of commentary there, so I expect some pushback. But is it going to have that much social political connotation there?
um, so I guess you know about the left wing, right wing thing, wokeness, etc., going on in the US and the Europe,
Yes.
right? So they view all of it as from this angle. So basically, if anything, if there is anything which suggest, if there are any articles which suggest that Iran or Armenia was the PI homeland, and they start blaming it on the wokeness of academia, for example.
Oh.
That yeah, that there are. I mean, not Davidsky. I mean, I'm talking about the people who frequent his blog, mostly were Europeans and white people. So white nationalists are also frequenters of that blog. I mean, I'm not using that word pejoratively, but that's, I mean, the people who want a Kurgan hypothesis to be true, for Europe to be the homeland of PIE, there'll obviously be people who are uh, local to that region, and they would be nationalists and would want their region to be the origin of all these languages across Eurasia. So these are the people
That's
who also
really
do frequent this
interesting.
blog.
I mean, when you see that it's the leftist crowd as such, which would posit the Aryan invasion theory here, and so there's a lot of pushback against them here. And on the other side, the pushback is from the, towards the leftists, even from the European right wing, so to speak, if
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what we call it. It's not
I
particularly
mean, it's common, right? This is the common aspect between both these groups.
right. Right.
So the common
So,
aspect is the Europeans positing a European homeland get pushback from the leftists, but I've actually not seen any leftists on the blog. It's on Davidsky's blog itself who oppose them. Mainly the leftists for them are the academia people who are, in my view, looking at things critically.
I
Similarly, in
see.
India, for the out of India theorists, you see a lot of pushback, much more pushback, visible pushback from the left wing people. I have not seen any visible pushback from left wingers in the Europe. in
So
Europe.
that was my question. I haven't seen that sort of fraught discussion happening yet, but the more and more, say the BMAC archaeological evidence that you discussed here, that becoming more mainstream would possibly cause that sort of pushback maybe. But I just don't think that genetics or I think that in Europe and especially in the US, there's a lot of acceptance that we're all mixed up genetically. There's a lot of acceptance of that intrinsically, so it's not tied to a lot of socio-political debates yet. So, except for CRT, that's trying to do it at a superficial level of saying 26% privileged and 72% privileged or whatever else they think of. But that's so superficial that it's not based in any hard sciences, so to speak.
Right.
So,
No, yeah. So the amount of pushback that we see in India from leftists to against the out of India theory, for sure, from normal people we do not see a similar thing in from European people.
yes, yes,
But what
yes.
the right wingers do on blogs like Davidsky is that they blame academics for being influenced by woke politics and leftism.
Right.
I'm not sure there is any truth in that accusation, but that's what they do.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the channel, Ashish, and I look forward to having you have a new blog since you mentioned you haven't posted in a while. I hope you do that, and I see you next month as well. Thank you so much for a very fascinating conversation, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sagari.